76 years. That's how long Eleanor Carter waited for the truth about her husband, Captain Daniel Carter, a WAI pilot declared missing in action. But when a letter arrives with a shocking revelation, she embarks on a journey to uncover a secret buried for decades. Love, sacrifice, and a war that never truly ended. This is a story of promises kept against all odds. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories like this. Eleanor Carter sat alone in the dim glow of her Virginia home, the walls around her filled with photographs that had aged alongside her. The air smelled faintly of old books and lavender, the scent of time itself. At 90 years old, she had lived a life that others called long and full, but she knew the truth. Her life had been lived in waiting, a waiting that had lasted 76 years. She ran her frail fingers over the edge of an unopened letter resting on her lap. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the name in the return address sent a tremor through her chest. David Calloway. The historian had contacted her months ago, speaking of declassified military records, of discoveries in old archives, of Daniel. She had ignored the calls, the emails, the polite letters. What was left to say? The war had taken Daniel Carter from her in 1944, labeling him missing in action, leaving her with nothing but an empty telegram and a silence that stretched across the decades. She had never remarried, never moved on. People called it devotion, some called it tragedy. She called it a promise. Yet, the weight of the letter in her hands felt different. He had sent another message 2 weeks ago, a single line in trembling ink. Mrs. Carter, you deserve to know the truth. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Eleanor rarely had visitors. With careful movements, she placed the letter on the table beside her and made her way to the door, her steps slow but steady. When she opened it, a man stood in the late afternoon sunlight, his silhouette cutting against the golden hues of the autumn sky. Mrs. Carter. The voice was careful, gentle. Eleanor narrowed her gaze, taking in the man before her. Mid-40s, tall, with the posture of someone accustomed to patience. His hands were empty, but the briefcase at his feet suggested the weight of something far heavier. "You're Calloway," she said. He nodded, offering a small smile. "I hoped we could talk." Eleanor considered shutting the door. She had spent years building walls around herself, and the past was not a place she was eager to revisit. But something about the way he stood there, about the quiet certainty in his expression, made her hesitate. "Fine," she said, stepping aside. "But if you're selling memories, I stopped buying a long time ago." Inside, she led him to the sitting room. He glanced around, his eyes lingering on the photographs, old black-and-white images of a young couple frozen in time. A woman with bright eyes, a man in uniform, a love that never faded. "I won't waste your time," David said, sitting across from her. "I know you've spent your life believing Daniel was lost over Europe, that he never came home. But, Mrs. Carter," his voice softened, "what if I told you that isn't the whole truth?" Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, a sensation she hadn't known in years. "You think I haven't heard this before?" she scoffed. "People love a good ghost story. I've read the conspiracy theories. I've had men like you, historians, researchers, even crackpot journalists, tell me Daniel was everything from a prisoner of war to a deserter. You think I haven't spent 76 years listening to every possibility?" David leaned forward, his expression unwavering. "I don't deal in theories, Mrs. Carter. I deal in facts." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, aged folder. The cover was stamped with the faded seal of the United States Army Air Forces. Eleanor stared at it, her breath caught somewhere between anticipation and dread. David hesitated only a moment before he flipped it open. The first page bore a name that sent ice through her veins. Captain Daniel Carter, Case File 11327. The date on the report read March 2, 1945 months after she had been told he was gone. "That's not possible," she whispered. David placed another document before her, yellowed with age but still clear as day. A field report from a Major Charles Whitmore, detailing the crash of Daniel's plane over occupied France in June 4, 1944. She had read versions of this report before, the same cold, clinical language. Pilot presumed dead, no body recovered. But beneath it there was something new, a section that had been blacked out, redacted. David slid a second document across the table, this one more recent. "This," he said, "is the same report, only now with the redactions lifted." Eleanor's eyes traced the newly revealed words, her breath catching on one line. "Survivor taken by unknown forces. Local intelligence reports suspect involvement of French resistance. Status unconfirmed." She stared, her mind reeling. "Survivor. Taken." Her voice trembled. "You're telling me he didn't die in that crash?" David exhaled, his expression both careful and resolute. "Mrs. Carter, your husband didn't die that day. He survived." The room seemed to close in around her. The decades, the silence, the waiting. It all crashed down like a wave, dragging her beneath. She gripped the arms of her chair, steadying herself. "I need you to listen carefully," David said, "because what I found goes beyond anything the military ever told you." Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Go on." He pulled out a final piece of paper. A photograph, old but well preserved. It showed a grave deep in the heart of France. A small unmarked stone hidden away in a village that Eleanor had never heard of. But it wasn't the grave that made her heart pound. It was what was carved into the base. D.C. David placed another photograph beside it, this time a close-up, and there, beneath the initials, in letters barely visible against the weathered stone, were two words. For Eleanor. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Her world was tilting, unraveling. "How?" she managed. "How could this have been hidden for so long?" David's expression darkened, because someone wanted it buried. The truth about what happened to Daniel, it was never meant to be found. A beat of silence. Then David leaned forward, his voice steady. "I'm going to France in a week, to that village. The people there have kept his memory alive without even knowing his name. I believe they know more than the records tell us. And, Mrs. Carter," his voice softened, "I think you should come with me." Eleanor gripped the pendant at her neck, the angel wings worn smooth from decades of touch. She had spent 76 years waiting, hoping, dreading. She had told herself she would never chase shadows. But this was no shadow. This was Daniel, and it was time to bring him home. The ballroom shimmered under the warm glow of chandeliers, the polished floor reflecting the twinkling lights like a sea of golden stars. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, whiskey, and the faint trace of cigar smoke. Elegance, mingling with the sharp undercurrent of war. It was 1943, and the officers' ball in Washington, D.C. was one of the few moments where those heading to battle could pretend, if only for a night, that the world was not falling apart. Eleanor Montgomery had not planned to attend. Her best friend, Vivian, had spent the entire week convincing her, claiming that a night out was exactly what she needed. "You can't hide in the library forever, Ellie," Vivian had said. "Come dance, drink, maybe even find a dashing soldier to sweep you off your feet." Eleanor had rolled her eyes at the suggestion, but in the end she had relented, pulling on a midnight blue dress that hugged her figure in a way that made her feel just a little less invisible. Now, as she stood by the grand window overlooking the city, she felt like an imposter among the women in silk and the men in crisp uniforms. They laughed, they drank, and they danced as if the war didn't exist beyond these walls. Eleanor was not like them. She was a librarian, a lover of books and quiet spaces, not of dazzling ballrooms and fleeting flirtations. And yet, something about the night felt different, charged, as if fate had woven its invisible thread around her. A deep, rich voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd behind her. "You look like someone who'd rather be anywhere else." She turned, startled, and found herself staring into a pair of piercing blue eyes. The man before her stood tall, his Air Force uniform tailored to perfection. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had run his fingers through it moments before. His jaw was strong, lined with just the faintest shadow of stubble, and there was something in his expression, an amusement, a challenge, that made Eleanor's breath catch. She straightened, narrowing her gaze. "And you look like someone who's used to saying whatever comes to mind." The man's lips curled into a slow smile. "Only when I see something interesting." Eleanor arched a brow. "Is that a line?" "If it was, did it work?" he countered smoothly. She let out a small huff, half a laugh, half an exasperated sigh. "You'll have to do better than that." The man chuckled, extending his hand. "Daniel Carter, Captain, United States Army Air Forces." Eleanor hesitated before placing her fingers in his palm. "Eleanor Montgomery, librarian, lover of books, terrible dancer." His grip was warm, steady. A librarian at a dance. That's unexpected. "A pilot without a date," she said, tilting her head. "Even more unexpected." He grinned, stepping closer. "Maybe I was waiting for the right person." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She was not the type of woman who attracted attention in rooms like this. She was the one standing at the edges, observing, listening, not the one caught in the gravitational pull of a man like Daniel Carter. The band struck up a slower tune, and for a moment, the world softened around them. Daniel inclined his head. "Would you like to test that terrible dancer theory?" Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't the kind of woman who fell for easy charm or reckless flirtation, and yet something about him, the confidence, the quiet intensity beneath the playful words, made her say, "One dance." His hand slid into hers, guiding her onto the floor. The music swelled, and she felt his other hand settle gently at the small of her back, warm through the fabric of her dress. They moved together, his steps easy, guiding, as if he had done this 100 times before. "So," he murmured, "is it true?" She looked up. "What?" "That you're a terrible dancer." Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Not completely. I just prefer reading about grand romances rather than participating in them." Daniel smirked. Ah, so you're a cynic. Not a cynic, just a realist. He twirled her effortlessly, bringing her close again. Well then, let's make a deal. You let me prove that some things are worth stepping off the page for. She wanted to argue, to tell him that real life rarely mirrored the novels she adored. But the way he looked at her, as if he saw something beyond the careful walls she had built, made her wonder, just for a moment, if he could be right. The song ended too soon. She expected him to let go, to step back and let the moment fade. Instead, he held onto her hand a beat longer than necessary, his thumb brushing lightly against her knuckles. "Come with me," he said suddenly. Eleanor blinked. What? He gestured toward the terrace. A little fresh air, no dancing required. She hesitated, then nodded. He led her outside, where the air was crisp against her skin. The city stretched out before them, lights flickering in the distance. A reminder of a world beyond this fleeting moment. Daniel leaned against the railing, watching her. "You don't come to these things often." Eleanor shook her head. "I prefer quiet places. And yet, you're here. Vivian convinced me." His smirk returned. "Remind me to thank her." She rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the smile tugging at her lips. "What about you? Why are you here, instead of off being a hero?" His expression shifted, just slightly. Heroes don't usually get a choice in the matter. Eleanor frowned. "That sounds ominous." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I ship out soon. Another mission, another city, another sky." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. "Do you know where?" A small pause. "France." Her stomach nodded. She had heard the stories. Missions gone wrong, pilots who never returned. "Are you scared?" Daniel's gaze met hers, steady. "Not for myself." The silence stretched between them, filled with unsaid words. Elena found herself reaching for his hand before she could second-guess the impulse. He looked down at their joined fingers, then back at her. "I don't know what's waiting for me out there," he admitted, "but tonight, I just wanted to feel like something still makes sense." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Then let's pretend," she whispered. "Just for tonight." His grip tightened, just slightly. I like the sound of that. She knew then, whether she wanted to or not, she would remember this night for the rest of her life. And she had no idea just how much it would cost her. The engine hummed beneath him, a steady vibration that traveled through his bones as Captain Daniel Carter tightened his grip on the control stick. The sky stretched endlessly before him, a vast ocean of blue and silver, but the horizon was a battleground. He could see them now, dark specks in the distance, moving like shadows against the sun. "Ghost Squadron, Titan formation," came the calm, clipped voice of Major Charles Whitmore through the crackling radio. "Enemy fighters at 12 o'clock. Stay sharp." Daniel inhaled deeply, steadying his nerves. This wasn't his first dogfight, and it wouldn't be his last. At least, that's what he told himself. Below them, France lay shrouded in mist, villages and fields rolling out beneath the wings of their P-51 Mustangs. Somewhere down there, people went about their lives, unaware of the battle about to unfold above their heads. A flicker of movement. Then, another. "They're coming in fast," Daniel muttered, fingers flexing over the trigger. The enemy planes cut through the clouds, sharp angles of steel and death. Within seconds, the sky erupted with gunfire. Tracers lit up the heavens, streaking past like angry stars. Daniel banked hard to the left, dodging a spray of bullets, his pulse hammering. Whitmore's voice rang out again. "Stay with your wingman. No lone wolves." Daniel's wingman, Lieutenant Sam Hayes, stuck close, weaving through the chaos alongside him. They had trained for this, they had fought for this, but training couldn't prepare a man for the sickening crack of metal tearing, the sudden scream of engines spiraling downward. "6 o'clock, Danny," Hayes shouted. Daniel's gut twisted as a Messerschmitt tailed him, its guns flashing. He yanked the stick back, sending his Mustang into a sharp climb. The German pilot followed, relentless. Daniel's jaw tightened. He needed an opening. Then, an explosion, a burst of flames. "Got him!" Hayes whooped over the radio, having taken out the enemy on Daniel's tail. Daniel didn't have time to thank him. More fighters swarmed, and all he could do was react. He twisted, fired, dove, climbed, bullets slicing past, engines howling. The sky was fire and death, and there was no room for hesitation. Then came the order. "Carter, Hayes, break off," Whitmore commanded. "New orders. You're to head deeper into enemy territory for an escort mission." "What?" Daniel shouted over the roar of battle. "We can't just—" "Orders from command," Whitmore cut him off. "Rendezvous with a high-priority target near Caen. This comes from the top." Daniel exchanged a look with Hayes, even though they couldn't see each other. Orders were orders, and yet, something about this felt wrong. But there was no time to argue. With a final glance at the raging battle behind them, they peeled off, racing toward a new mission they knew nothing about. The rendezvous point was a clearing just beyond a dense forest. They flew low, engines growling as they neared the coordinates. Below, movement. A convoy. Trucks kicking up dust as they sped down a dirt road. "Is that?" Hayes began. But Daniel already saw it. A Nazi convoy. A heavily armed one. And beside it, something unexpected. A small transport vehicle. Carrying passengers. Prisoners. "Command, this is Carter," Daniel barked into the radio. "We've got civilians down there. Repeat, civilians in the convoy." Silence. Daniel's pulse pounded. "Command, do you copy? Do we engage?" Static. Then Whitmore's voice. "Carter, stay on mission." Daniel's stomach turned. He could see them now. Figures huddled in the back of the transport, faces pale, hollow. Resistance fighters, perhaps? Allied spies? Whoever they were running out of time. "I'm going in," Daniel said. "Damn it, Carter," Hayes started, but Daniel was already diving. Gunfire exploded from below as the convoy realized what was happening. Daniel gritted his teeth, strafing the road, bullets kicking up dirt and metal. The truck carrying the prisoners swerved wildly, careening off the path and into the trees. "They're making a run for it," Hayes shouted. The Nazis wouldn't let them escape. Daniel's heart pounded. "Cover them." Hayes looped around, laying down suppressing fire as the prisoners bolted from the wreckage, vanishing into the forest. The remaining German soldiers scrambled, firing into the trees, but their attention was divided now, between the pilots above and the fighters escaping below. And then, just as victory seemed within reach, disaster struck. A piercing alarm screamed through Daniel's cockpit. "Carter, brake! Brake!" Hayes yelled. But it was too late. Something slammed into his right wing. A Messerschmitt had come out of nowhere, its bullets tearing through metal, igniting fuel. Daniel's world tilted. The Mustang shuddered violently, flames licking at the fuselage. "Danny," Hayes' voice was frantic. "Get out of there!" The cockpit filled with smoke. The ground was rushing toward him. He tried to pull up, to regain control, but the stick was dead in his hands. He had only one option. His fingers fumbled for the latch on the canopy. The wind screamed as he forced it open. Then, with one final breath, he jumped. The air hit him like a hammer, the force of it tearing at his limbs. He yanked the ripcord. A second of terror, then a snap, and the chute deployed, jerking him upward. Below, the forest waited. Above, Hayes's voice crackled in his ear. "Carter, do you copy?" Daniel barely had time to respond before he crashed through the canopy of trees, branches whipping against his face, his body slamming against wood and earth. Then, nothing. Darkness. When he came to, the world was still. The sounds of battle were distant, muted by the thickness of the woods. Pain lanced through his ribs as he tried to sit up. A shadow moved. Daniel tensed. Then a voice, low, urgent, "Stay down!" A man emerged from the brush, rifle in hand. His clothes were worn, his face smeared with dirt, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. French. Resistance. "You are American?" the man whispered. Daniel nodded, still dazed. "Captain Daniel Carter." The man glanced over his shoulder. "They are looking for you." Daniel didn't have to ask who. "The convoy," he rasped. "Did they escape?" The Frenchman nodded. "Thanks to you." Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. A new sound cut through the forest. German voices. Close. The Frenchman's eyes darkened. "We must go. Now." Daniel tried to stand, but his legs buckled. The Frenchman caught him, slinging one of Daniel's arms over his shoulders. "You saved us, Captain," he murmured. "Now we save you." With that, they disappeared into the trees. Behind them, the enemy closed in. The telegram arrived on a cold morning in November 1944. The envelope was thin, almost weightless, yet when Eleanor Montgomery held it in her hands, it felt as heavy as the world itself. The inked words stared back at her, stark and final. "We regret to inform you that Captain Daniel Carter has been reported missing in action. His aircraft was last seen over occupied France. His status remains unknown. Further updates will follow." She read the words once, twice, a third time. Each repetition was a hammer to her ribs, a nail driven into her lungs. The world around her blurred. The ticking of the grandfather clock, the wind rattling against the window pane, the soft murmur of the radio playing in the background. Everything felt distant, like a dream she couldn't wake from. Missing. Not dead. It was a cruel distinction. A word that left just enough room for hope to survive, only to twist that hope into something unbearable. Lillian was the one who found her sitting at the kitchen table an hour later, the telegram still clutched in her hands. "Eleanor?" she whispered, voice filled with a kind of caution reserved for the wounded. Eleanor didn't look up. Her fingers traced the edges of the telegram, over and over, as if the movement could somehow change what was written there. "You promised," she said, her voice so quiet it barely reached the space between them. Lillian swallowed hard. "What can I do?" Eleanor finally lifted her gaze, her green eyes sharp with something fierce, something unshakable. "Find out what they aren't telling me." She didn't sleep that night, nor the next. Every hour that passed without news felt like a lifetime. And yet she clung to the idea that somewhere Daniel was still out there, waiting, fighting, surviving. She wrote letters, so many letters, to the War Department, to Daniel's commanding officers, to anyone who might have the answers she needed. Weeks passed, and the replies came back in tidy, impersonal phrases. No further information, search efforts ongoing. Classified mission, details unavailable, presumed lost but not confirmed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. By January 1945, the war had taken more than just soldiers. It had taken patience, reason, and logic. Eleanor could feel the weight of people's expectations pressing in on her. "Move on," they whispered. "It's been months. Let him go." She refused. On a frigid morning, she went to the War Office in Washington, marching past secretaries and clerks until she stood before a captain in an office that smelled of dust and ink. "I need the truth," she demanded, gripping Daniel's last letter in her gloved hands. The officer, a man with tired eyes and a weary voice, sighed. "Miss Montgomery, I understand your pain, but Captain Carter's file is classified." "I don't care," she shot back. "I deserve to know what happened." The man hesitated. Perhaps it was the fire in her eyes, or perhaps it was the quiet desperation that had settled into her bones like a second skin. Either way, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's something strange about his case," he admitted. "The official report says he was shot down, that his plane went down near Cannes, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" Eleanor pressed. The captain exhaled, glancing toward the door as if someone might be listening. There were whispers. Soldiers who swore they saw a parachute. Locals in France who claimed an American pilot was taken from the wreckage by resistance fighters. But when we followed up, the reports vanished. The paperwork was... Eleanor's pulse pounded. "Erased?" The officer nodded. "It's as if someone wanted him to disappear." The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "If he was captured," she said, forcing the words out, "why wasn't he listed as a prisoner of war?" The captain's expression darkened. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Eleanor's hands trembled, but she forced herself to remain steady. This wasn't just a cruel twist of fate. Someone had buried the truth, and she would find out why. As the weeks dragged on, the world continued to change. Victory was on the horizon, but Eleanor's war had only just begun. Then, in late February, a letter arrived. One that wasn't from the military or the government or anyone she had contacted. The envelope was worn, the ink smudged. There was no return address. She tore it open with shaking hands. "Stop searching, he's gone, let him rest." There was no signature, no explanation. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She read the letter again, then again. But it didn't change. This was no official notice. It wasn't from the government. It was something else entirely. A warning. For the first time since the telegram arrived, a cold fear slithered down her spine. This wasn't just about a missing pilot. This was a secret someone didn't want uncovered. She pressed a hand to the silver pendant hanging around her neck, the one Daniel had given her the night they danced on the balcony. Her fingers clenched around the wings. "You promised me," she whispered. Her mind was set. If Daniel was out there, she would find him. And if he was gone, Then she would find out who had buried the truth, no matter the cost. The journey to France was not one Eleanor Carter had ever imagined taking, not after all these years, not after decades of unanswered questions, after a lifetime of waiting, after a war that had taken more than just the man she loved. Yet, as she sat in the quiet hum of the airplane cabin, the city lights of Washington, D.C. shrinking below her, she felt something shift in the marrow of her bones. A certainty. This was not a pilgrimage of grief. This was a hunt for the truth. David Calloway sat beside her, reviewing documents in the dim glow of the overhead light. He had spent years chasing history, tracking down lost stories, unearthing the forgotten. But this was something different. "I've arranged for us to meet with a local historian in Caen," David said, breaking the silence between them. "His name is Philippe Moreau. He specializes in wartime records, specifically the accounts of French resistance fighters." Eleanor nodded but said nothing. David hesitated before adding, "He believes your husband was taken by the Marquis." Eleanor turned to him, her green eyes sharp despite the exhaustion of travel. "The Marquis?" "The underground resistance. They were responsible for sabotage missions, intelligence gathering, and rescuing downed Allied pilots." He paused. "But if they did take Daniel in, there's no record of what happened to him afterward." Eleanor exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to the silver pendant hanging from her neck. "So he was alive," she murmured. David nodded. "For at least some time after the crash, yes." She swallowed. She had known this, had suspected it for months now, but hearing it spoken aloud did something to her. It made the past shift, altering the shape of history itself. For 76 years, Daniel had been a ghost. Now he was something else. They landed in Paris before dawn, the air crisp with the lingering chill of winter. The train to Caen was long, the countryside passing in muted shades of gray and green. Eleanor stared out the window, her mind a battlefield of memories. She had pictured this moment before. What it would be like to walk the land where Daniel had fallen, to stand in the place where his life had been stolen from him. But what if she had been wrong? What if he had lived? What if he had fought to come back to her, and failed? That thought haunted her more than anything else. By the time they arrived in Caen, the sun had risen, casting long golden rays across the ancient stone buildings. Philippe Moreau was waiting for them outside a small cafe, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair, and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You must be Mrs. Carter," he said in accented English, offering a polite nod. "Eleanor," she corrected, shaking his hand. Philippe's grip was firm but not unkind. "You've come a long way." She nodded. "I intend to go further." Philippe smiled at that, gesturing for them to follow him inside. They sat at a corner table, the scent of fresh coffee thick in the air. Philippe spread a handful of documents across the table, some aged and yellowed, others freshly printed from digital archives. "I have spent many years researching the lost soldiers of the war," he began, "but Captain Carter's case is unusual." Eleanor's breath hitched slightly. "How so?" Philippe tapped one of the documents. "Because he was not simply a missing pilot. He became something more." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the coffee cup, her knuckles pale. Philippe slid a grainy black and white photograph toward her. It showed a group of men standing in the woods, dressed in civilian clothing, their faces shadowed beneath the branches of tall trees. A wartime photograph, likely taken in secret. She scanned their faces quickly, her pulse quickening. And then there, her breath caught. It was blurry, but she would have known him anywhere. Daniel, standing among them. His hair was longer than it had been when she last saw him, his uniform replaced with a dark jacket. But it was him. She reached out, pressing her fingers to the image as if she could touch the past itself. This was taken in early 1945, Philippe said gently. He was alive, Eleanor. The air in her lungs felt too heavy. Then what happened? Philippe exhaled, leaning back in his chair. That, he admitted, is where the records become unclear. Eleanor tore her gaze from the photograph. What do you mean? Philippe hesitated. There are conflicting reports. Some say the Marquis attempted to smuggle him out of France. Others suggest he stayed behind to fight. And then, he paused, choosing his words carefully, there is one account that claims he was taken. Eleanor's stomach turned. By who? Philippe met her eyes. The Gestapo. The room seemed to close in around her. No, she whispered. That's not possible. David was already flipping through the documents, his expression grim. If that's true, why wasn't he listed as a prisoner of war? Philippe sighed. Because if the Gestapo took him, he would not have been a normal POW. The Maquis were seen as terrorists by the Germans. Any Allied soldier found working with them, he hesitated. They were not taken to prison camps. Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment. She had spent decades imagining what had happened to him. She had convinced herself that he had died in the crash, that it had been quick, painless. But this was something worse. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain steady. Where? She asked finally. Where did they take him? Philippe exchanged a glance with David before answering. There is a place, he said slowly. An abandoned chateau near the village of Saint-Martin-le-Land. The locals say it was used by the Gestapo as an interrogation site. Eleanor straightened. Take me there. David frowned. Eleanor, maybe we should. Take me there, she repeated, her voice steady. Philippe studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right. They left before midday, driving through winding country roads lined with trees that had stood witness to a war long past. Eleanor said nothing as they drove, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had come all this way. She would not leave without answers. The village of Saint-Martin-le-Land was small, tucked away in the hills like a secret whispered between the trees. The chateau stood at the edge of it, its stone walls weathered by time. Eleanor stepped out of the car, her heart hammering. She could feel it. Something of him lingered here. They walked toward the ruins, Philippe leading the way. The wind was soft against her skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and forgotten stories. And then, something caught her eye. A carving, half hidden beneath the moss and vines on the outer wall. She stepped closer, her breath catching as she traced the faint, weathered letters. E.C., her initials. Her knees buckled, and David was there, steadying her. He was here, she whispered. David exhaled sharply. Eleanor. But she wasn't listening. Because beneath her initials, barely visible against the stone, were two more words. For Eleanor. The world tilted. 76 years. 76 years of waiting, of wondering, of whispering his name into the dark. And now, here he was. She pressed a trembling hand to the stone, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'm here," she murmured, and for the first time in her life, she knew. He had never stopped trying to come home to her. The cold stone walls of the chateau held the ghosts of whispered confessions and unanswered screams. The air was thick, stale with the scent of damp earth and time. Even now, decades later, the walls seemed to breathe with the memories of those who had been dragged inside and never walked out again. Daniel Carter had never believed in ghosts. Not until now. His wrists burned from the tight grip of the rope binding them, his body aching from the blows he had endured. He had lost track of how many days had passed since the Gestapo had taken him, since the Maquis fighters who had risked their lives to shelter him had been slaughtered before his eyes. He had fought. God, he had fought. But even the strongest man could be broken. The cell was barely large enough to move. A single flickering oil lamp cast shadows against the walls, its dim glow revealing the rough stone floor beneath him. His uniform was gone, replaced with rags, his face unshaven, his lips cracked from dehydration. Somewhere above him, footsteps echoed, slow, measured. Then the sound of a key turning in the lock. Daniel didn't lift his head. He had learned that showing defiance only bought him more pain. A sharp click. The iron door groaned open and Boots stepped into the cell. A man's voice, smooth, clipped, and laced with an arrogance Daniel had come to hate. "Captain Carter," the man drawled, "how nice of you to join us again." Daniel said nothing. He knew this man, Colonel Reinhard Weiss. The Gestapo officer had interrogated him for days, maybe weeks. Time had lost meaning in this place. Still refusing to speak, Weiss sighed, crouching beside him. "You Americans are so stubborn. But you see, Captain, I already know everything I need to. You were taken in by the French resistance. You aided them in their sabotage. You were a traitor to your own survival." Daniel lifted his head, his gray eyes burning. "Fighting against murderers isn't treason," he rasped. His throat was raw, each word costing him. Weiss only smiled. "I suppose it is fortunate, then, that your loyalty will soon be irrelevant." A beat of silence. Then the German reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something that gleamed faintly in the low light. Daniel's heart stopped. It was her pendant, the angel wings. Weiss let the chain dangle between his fingers. "Ah," he murmured, watching Daniel's face closely. "I wondered if this would mean something to you." Daniel lunged forward, but the bindings held him back. His breath came fast, ragged. "Where did you get that?" he growled. Weiss tilted his head. "Such devotion," he mused. "An American pilot, captured, starving, beaten within an inch of his life. Yet still, it is not your country you ask about. It is her." Daniel swallowed hard, his pulse roaring in his ears. "Eleanor." Weiss tucked the pendant back into his pocket. "You see, Captain Carter, every man has a breaking point." He leaned closer, his voice almost gentle. "I wonder, will it be her who breaks you?" Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stillness. That was the moment, he knew. They were never going to let him go. They hadn't even planned to take him prisoner. This wasn't about information anymore. It was about erasure. A slow, quiet death in the dark. Weiss straightened, dusting off his coat. "You will be transferred tomorrow," he announced. "There is a facility in the east, far from here, where men disappear and are never spoken of again. I would advise you to make peace with whatever God you believe in." Then, without another word, he turned and strode toward the door. Daniel's voice was raw when he spoke. "You can kill me," he said, forcing the words past cracked lips. "But I promise you, one day, someone will come looking." Weiss paused, glancing back over his shoulder. A smirk. "I sincerely doubt that." The door slammed shut and the locks slid into place. Silence settled once more. But in the darkness, Daniel Carter was already making a plan. That night, as the cold seeped into his bones, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His hands flexed against the rope binding them, testing, memorizing the tension, the knot. Tomorrow he would be moved, which meant tonight was his last chance, his only chance. He had spent months with the Maquis, learned their ways, learned patience, learned how to wait for the right moment. And now, that moment was here. He took a slow breath, steadying his pulse. Then, he began. Using the last reserves of his strength, he shifted his wrists, feeling for any weakness in the rope. It was tight, but not perfect. The guards had grown overconfident, sloppy. He worked the bonds, pain lancing through his fingers, but he didn't stop. Minutes passed, hours. Then, a shift, a give. Daniel bit back a sound of triumph, twisting harder. A final pull, then freedom. The rope fell away. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself upright, his muscles screaming in protest. He ignored it. He had no time. He pressed his ear against the cell door. Silence. But that meant nothing. The oil lamp flickered beside him. He reached for it, tilting it toward the wooden chair in the corner of the cell. Then he let it fall. The fire spread quickly, licking up the chair's legs, devouring the old wood. Smoke curled upward, black and thick. Within moments, shouts erupted in the hallway. A key jangled in the lock. Daniel pressed himself against the wall. The door burst open. The guard barely had time to register what was happening before Daniel moved. With the last of his strength, he lunged, grabbing the man's head and slamming it into the stone wall. The guard crumpled. Daniel wasted no time. He grabbed the man's weapon, a German-issued carabiner rifle, then tore the pendant from the unconscious man's pocket, shoving it into his own. The weight of it grounded him. Then he ran. The hallway was chaos, flames growing, guards shouting. The smoke would cover him, but only for so long. He sprinted down the corridor, his bare feet silent against the stone, turning corner after corner. Ahead, an opening, a door leading to the outer courtyard. Freedom. He bolted toward it. Then, a gunshot. Fire bloomed in his shoulder. He stumbled, but didn't fall. He turned, lifting the rifle. One shot. The guard dropped. Pain surged, but he forced himself forward, his legs burning. The courtyard was open. The night sky above him vast and endless. The stars. For the first time in months, he could see the stars. He tore through the gates, his breath ragged. Behind him, sirens wailed, more shouts, more gunfire. He didn't stop. He would not stop. The forest loomed ahead, dark and waiting. Daniel Carter ran toward the trees, toward freedom, toward home. The night air was sharp against his skin, burning his lungs with every breath. His shoulder throbbed, the gunshot wound leaving a trail of warmth that seeped through his torn shirt. But Daniel Carter didn't stop. He couldn't. The trees loomed ahead, dark and waiting. Freedom was there, somewhere beyond the towering trunks and tangled undergrowth. Behind him, the shouts of German soldiers echoed through the courtyard, their boots pounding against the stone. Sirens wailed, piercing through the quiet countryside. His body screamed for rest, for relief, but he had learned long ago that exhaustion was a luxury he couldn't afford. He surged forward, forcing himself into the shadows of the forest. The instant he crossed the tree line, the world shifted. Darkness wrapped around him, swallowing him whole. He ran. Twigs snapped beneath his feet. The scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. He kept low, zigzagging through the trees, knowing they would send dogs after him if he didn't put enough distance between himself and the burning chateau. He could still hear the fire crackling behind him. An unintentional gift. It would buy him time. The Germans would have to choose between containing the blaze and hunting him down. He hoped they chose wrong. Minutes stretched into an eternity. His pulse pounded, his vision blurring at the edges. He knew he was losing blood. He needed to stop. Needed to... A gunshot cracked through the night. Bark exploded near his head, sending splinters across his cheek. He dropped low, rolling behind a fallen tree just as more bullets whizzed through the air. They were closer than he thought. He gritted his teeth. "Move, Carter, move." Pushing himself up, he darted deeper into the woods, ducking behind the thick trunks, using the moonlight filtering through the canopy to navigate. The terrain sloped downward, and he let gravity take him, half running, half sliding down the embankment. Mud clung to his hands, the cold seeping into his bones, but he didn't stop. Then, suddenly, silence. No gunshots, no shouts. The forest had swallowed the noise. Daniel pressed himself against a tree, chest rising and falling in sharp, ragged breaths. He strained his ears. Nothing. Either he had lost them, or they were waiting. Then, movement, a rustle, a whisper of footsteps against the underbrush. Daniel swung his rifle up, his finger hovering over the trigger. And then, a voice, soft, urgent. "Ne tire pas, don't shoot." The French. Daniel didn't lower his weapon, but his grip loosened slightly. A shadow shifted in front of him, barely visible in the darkness. A man stepped forward, his hands raised. Daniel recognized him instantly. Pierre Dumas, one of the resistance fighters who had smuggled him away after his crash. "You are supposed to be dead," Pierre whispered. Daniel let out a short, breathless laugh. "Yeah, well, that makes two of us." Pierre's eyes flicked to the blood staining his shirt. "You're hurt." "Not as bad as I could be." Daniel swallowed hard, his body swaying slightly. "But we need to move. They'll be on my trail." Pierre nodded once, then turned, gesturing for Daniel to follow. They moved quickly, weaving through the trees in near silence. Pierre knew these words: every hidden path, every safe house. Daniel trusted him because trust was the only thing keeping him alive. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. A small stone cottage sat nestled between the trees, its roof sagging slightly with age. Pierre gave 2 quick knocks, then another, a code. The door cracked open. A woman peered out, her face lined with worry. When she saw Daniel, her expression shifted from fear to something like disbelief. "Mon Dieu," she breathed. "You survived." Daniel swayed slightly, his vision tilting. For now. Then the world blurred, and darkness took him. When Daniel woke, the world was soft and slow. Warmth. That was the first thing he registered, a fire crackling nearby, the scent of something earthy and rich. Soup, maybe. Pain. That was the second thing. A deep, dull throb in his shoulder, his ribs aching like they had been trampled. He blinked, his vision sharpening. He was inside the cottage, lying on a thin mattress in the corner. Pierre sat nearby, speaking in hushed French, with the woman who had let them in. Daniel tried to sit up. Pain shot through his shoulder. Pierre turned, shaking his head. Restez tranquille. Stay still. Daniel exhaled sharply, leaning back against the mattress. How long? 2 days, Pierre answered. You lost a lot of blood. If Marie hadn't stitched you up, you wouldn't have made it. Daniel's gaze flicked to the woman. Marie? She offered a small, grim smile. My husband fought with the Marquis. The Germans took him last winter. A shadow passed over her features. I help where I can. Daniel's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Marie shook her head. You saved our people. The least I can do is help save you. He nodded, swallowing against the weight in his chest. Pierre leaned forward. We need to get you out of France. Daniel exhaled. He had known this was coming. There's a safe route, Pierre continued, through the Pyrenees, into Spain. Daniel's fingers curled into the blanket beneath him. He could make it. He could get out. But something inside him resisted. Daniel, Pierre pressed, if they find you again, they won't take you prisoner. Daniel closed his eyes. Eleanor. She was waiting for him. He had promised. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Something wasn't finished. He looked at Pierre. Weiss. Pierre frowned. What? Weiss, Daniel repeated. The Gestapo officer. He knows things. About resistance operations. About how we move pilots. About how we smuggle weapons. Pierre's jaw tightened. Daniel pushed himself up, wincing. If I leave, he'll keep hunting. Not just me. You, your people. Silence. Then Pierre swore under his breath. You're insane. Daniel let out a breathless laugh. Maybe. Pierre studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, If you stay, we do this my way. Daniel nodded, agreed. Marie, who had been silent, crossed her arms. And what exactly is your way? Pierre smiled grimly. We kill Colonel Weiss. 3 days later, Daniel stood in the ruins of an old bell tower, his rifle in his hands. Below him, the village of Saint-Martin-le-Lant was quiet. And then, movement. A German convoy rolled through the cobbled streets, engines low and growling. At the front, Colonel Reinhard Weiss. Daniel's pulse was steady. This time, he wasn't running. This time, he was ending it. He lined up the shot, exhaling slowly. The world narrowed to a single moment. A single breath, a single pull of the trigger. And then, the past shattered, and Daniel Carter took his first step toward home. The bullet hit its mark. Colonel Reinhard Weiss staggered, a crimson bloom spreading across the pristine gray of his uniform. His eyes widened in shock as he clutched his chest, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. For a moment, he remained standing, swaying on unsteady legs. Then, with a final, graceless collapse, he fell to the cobblestone street below. Daniel Carter remained still, his rifle barrel cooling in the evening air. From his vantage point in the bell tower, he watched as panic erupted below. German soldiers shouted in confusion, scrambling for cover, searching for the sniper that had just taken out one of their own. But they wouldn't find him, not before it was too late. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. The mission wasn't finished yet. The shot had been clean. No hesitation, no remorse. It was done. Weiss, the man who had tormented him, the man who had murdered his friends, the man who had threatened Eleanor's memory just to break him, was dead, and now it was time to disappear. Daniel slung his rifle over his shoulder and slipped away from the window, moving quickly down the spiral staircase of the abandoned church. His ribs ached from the exertion, his shoulder wound pulling with every step, but he gritted his teeth against the pain. He had survived worse. By the time he emerged into the shadows of the village, Pierre and Marie were already waiting in the alleyway, their faces tight with urgency. "You did it," Pierre breathed. Daniel simply nodded. "Now let's get out of here." Marie handed him a thick cloak, one of the many disguises they had prepared for their escape. He threw it over his shoulders, pulling the hood low over his face. The three of them moved swiftly through the back streets, slipping past German patrols, their footfalls silent against the cobblestones. The plan was simple: reach the safe house, then head for the border. Spain. That was where freedom lay. As they navigated through the narrow streets, Daniel's mind raced. This was it. After months of hiding, after enduring capture, torture, and betrayal, he was finally going home. Home. The word felt foreign on his tongue, an impossible dream. But then, Eleanor. She had never left his mind, not for a second. Through every moment of agony, through every near-death experience, she had been there. In the dark, in his quiet prayers, in the desperate promise he had made himself. "I will find my way back to you." They reached the edge of the village where a small cart was waiting. A farmer, one of the Resistance's allies, was already seated at the front, his weathered face unreadable. Pierre gave Daniel a nod. "This man will take you as far as Toulouse. From there, the route to Spain is clear." Daniel hesitated. "What about you?" Pierre exhaled, his expression dark. "We stay and fight. The war is not over for us." Daniel's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell Pierre that it wasn't worth it, that he should come with him, but he knew better. Pierre had made his choice, just as Daniel had made his. They clasped hands. No words were needed. Then Daniel climbed into the cart, ducking low beneath the sacks of grain that would help conceal him. As the cart lurched forward, he stole one last glance at the village he had nearly died in, the people who had saved him. Then he turned toward the road ahead, toward freedom, toward Eleanor. It took weeks to reach England. By the time Daniel finally arrived on British soil, his body was a collection of bruises and scars, but he was alive. And for the first time in a long time, he was a soldier again. Not a prisoner, not a ghost, a soldier. The British intelligence officers debriefed him for days, prying into every detail of his capture, his escape, his time with the French resistance. They wanted every scrap of information, and he gave it to them. But there was only one question that mattered to him. "When can I go home?" The officer across from him, a sharp-eyed woman with a clipboard full of classified documents, studied him carefully. "You'll be transported to Washington within the week, Captain Carter." Washington. His heart pounded. Eleanor. He didn't wait for an official escort. He found the nearest radio station and sent the message himself. It was short, barely more than a whisper across the airwaves. "Eleanor, it's me. I'm coming home." The train ride from New York to Washington, D.C. was a blur. The uniform they had given him felt strange against his skin, stiff and new, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered. All that mattered was her. As the city skyline came into view, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart slammed against his ribs. He had imagined this moment for so long. But what if she had moved on? What if she had stopped waiting? What if he had taken too long? The thought nearly made him sick. The train pulled into the station. Daniel stepped onto the platform. And there she was, Eleanor. She was standing at the far end of the station, her coat wrapped tightly around her small frame, her hands clutching the silver pendant at her neck. She hadn't moved. She hadn't looked away. She had been waiting. His breath caught. He took a step forward, and then another. And then he ran. She met him halfway, her arms colliding with his chest, her fingers gripping him as if he might disappear. He crushed her against him, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in. "I kept my promise," he whispered. Her voice broke. "So did I." Then, finally, after all the years, after all the pain, after all the waiting, Daniel Carter kissed his wife. And for the first time since he had fallen from the sky, he knew he was home. The war ended months later. Daniel was given medals, recognition, honors he never asked for. None of it mattered, because every night he came home to Eleanor. Every morning he woke beside her. And in the quiet moments, when the world had finally stopped burning, they sat on the porch of their small Virginia home, watching the sunrise. And he would take her hand, and she would smile, and they would remember, because love like theirs didn't fade. It endured. It survived. It won. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Some stories are not just about war, sacrifice, or survival. They are about love that withstands time, about promises that do not break, even when the world does. Daniel and Eleanor's journey reminds us that no matter how long the road, no matter how impossible the odds, love and faith have the power to endure. It teaches us that patience is not weakness but strength, that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on the battlefield but in the heart, and that home is not just a place, it is a person. Their story is not just theirs, it belongs to all of us who have ever loved, lost, and held on to hope. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from people around the world. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. There are many more untold stories waiting to be shared, and we can't wait for you to be part of them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.